that if anybody has questions as I'm going through this, then just ask the question. I don't know how you usually run these, Elizabeth. Do you mute everybody? And how are questions asked?
Your mic is off, Elizabeth.
That's true. I was prepared. I guess, you know, you could unmute yourself, or if everybody's just quiet, then it's not noisy, but sometimes there's a lot of background stuff. So I guess I could mute everybody but you, and if you have a question, you can unmute yourself. Does that work?
Yeah, that's fine.
Everybody? All right. Sounds good.
Okay. So as probably everybody else here, I shoot RAW, and as such, I need some type of RAW converter so I can see my pictures on the screen. I use two main programs for RAW conversion, either Photoshop Lightroom or Capture One Pro. I've been using Lightroom since it came out in about 2008, and I've been using Capture One Pro for about 7 years. I usually use the Capture One when I use a Fuji camera, and I use the Sony cameras with Adobe Photoshop. I don't know whether or not anybody is using Capture One Pro, so I had planned just to use Lightroom for RAW conversion tonight. What I thought I would do is go through my basic approach, my workflow in Lightroom and Photoshop. And I have a general approach, and then have some specific apps that I use for more specified type of things. So Lightroom. Let me pull up a picture. Everybody see that? Okay, this is a shot from Alaska that I took last year. As a couple of you know, I've been going up to Alaska for about 20 years with some friends and go fly fishing. We fly into Bethel, Alaska, which is on the Yukon Delta, and then fly out in one of the little planes to various headwater lakes and then float down the river, and the outfitter will pick us up at the bottom. Usually in a 2-week trip, I'll take 4,000 or 5,000 pictures, and then when I get back, I'll pick out 300, 400 of them and develop them, and then use Lightroom to do a book with blurb. So in this particular instance, going through my workflow, basic workflow in Lightroom, I usually spend about a minute or two in Lightroom, just basically getting a balanced exposure. I don't use many of the tools in Lightroom because I find that Photoshop does a much better job with most of the things that I do. So after I go into Photoshop, then what I'll do is I'll run a noise program. Right now I'm using Topaz AI noise reduction, followed by I'll take a look at taking any dust bunnies out of the picture and do any minor cloning that I might see at the time. Things like branches hanging in from the side, excuse me, or power lines, fence lines, things of that nature that I know I'm not going to take out of the picture. After I do that, then I look at color correction, and I will perform color correction using adjustment layers set to a blending mode of color. I want to separate color from luminosity as I do the first few steps of the workflow. So I'll correct for color, and then I will make adjustments to the tonal quality, the luminescence, contrast, and then I'll go back and take a second look at the color. From there, I use specific techniques geared towards the type of photograph I'm working on, such as perspective adjustments, compositional adjustments, replacing the sky, that type of thing. If I'm working on portraitures, then I may use a liquify filter. I'll do some more in-depth cloning. I do a lot of dodging and burning and things of that nature. After I get through with that, then I'll go ahead and run a blur and sharpening, and followed and topped off. Usually I'll run an old command in Photoshop, which is auto tone, and adjust my image, make sure that I have the full dynamic range in the photo. So that, in a nutshell, is how I approach almost all of my photos. Being a personality, it's pretty structured and it's very automated. I use a 3-monitor setup in Photoshop. So I have 2 monitors to the side where I have all of my palettes, and my main monitor is free to just have the picture on it. Tonight, because I'm sharing only one monitor, I put everything on my center monitor, so things are kind of cluttered. So going through, I said I spent about a minute or two in Lightroom. I'll show you, I'll start with this picture that I mentioned before, and this probably would take me about 10 to 15 seconds to get it to a exposure that I can move into Photoshop with. So if you look at the histogram up at the top, can everybody see that where my marker is? Okay, I see shaking heads. There is nothing in the quarter tones and there's nothing in the highlights. It's underexposed, but it's not plugged up at the bottom. So I would make an exposure adjustment and probably bring down the highlights a little bit. And that would be about it for this photograph. I always leave myself plenty of room at the bottom, so I'm not plugged up anything. And I always leave myself plenty of room at the top, so I can adjust the highlights in Photoshop at a later time.
Jim?
I don't usually...
Jim?
Is there a question? Yeah.
Yeah. I can't see your screen. Or it could be because I'm on my phone, but...
Can everybody else see the screen? I'm sharing my main screen, so that should be what you're seeing.
Yeah.
I can see it just clearly.
I can see it as well.
You can see it
Probably
well.
just because I'm on my phone.
Okay.
So that's all right.
Yeah, you just shit out of luck, Jonathan.
Well, wouldn't be the first time.
Wouldn't be the first time, huh? Okay.
That's the price of travel, John.
Yep.
So the exposure balance is fine in this shot. And usually what I also do is take a look at the colors in it. And if I run my cursor over the picture, then I get readouts directly underneath the histogram. And the readouts, if you can see them, say L, A, and B. And that's for lab color mode or lab color model. If you right click on the histogram, a pop-up box comes up. And at the bottom of the pop-up is show lab color values. If you uncheck that, you have the default setting for Lightroom, which are RGB percentages, which really make no sense whatsoever. So I always go with lab numbers. I don't know what that was. So I don't know how familiar people are with lab. Lab is a color reference model. It's based upon the human visual system. It's what's called a device independent color model as opposed to RGB, CMYK, RYB, HSB, HSL, etc., which are all device dependent color models. And it's, like I said, it's based on the human visual system, and it contains 3 channels, which when combined by the algorithm that Adobe uses, it gives you the color composite. Lab differs from RGB and most of the other color models in that color is separated entirely from luminance in the channels. So the L channel stands for light. And it gives values from 0 to 100, 0 being black, 100 being the brightest white imaginable. The A and the B channels contain only color information, no luminance information, and the values range from a negative 100 to 0 to a positive 100 in each of the two channels. And the color channels are color axis. So RGB, red, green, blue. In lab, you have color axes, and the axis in the A is green to magenta. The axis in the B is blue to yellow. If you take a look at the basic panel in Lightroom, and you look at the color area where temp and tint are, you'll notice that the temperature ranges from blue to yellow. And the tint slider ranges from green to magenta. So basically what you're looking at is the A channel and the B channel of lab in Lightroom. The reason I use the lab numbers is they make sense to me. In nature, if you're out taking a picture, our visual system is completely different from what a camera sees. We have a lot of different little quirks to our visual system that the camera won't pick up. And so in order to determine whether or not you may have a color problem, a color cast, which you may not realize, the computer will pick it up. So as an example, blues. Blues are going to be negative in the B channel, and in the A channel, they're going to be close to neutral, which is 0. So what I look for to see whether or not there's an excess of green, which is often the case, if the green value in the A, negative value, is more than -5 on average, you're looking at probably a cyan cast, at least in the sky. If it's more than about 2 in the positive, you're looking at the probability of a purple color cast. In the greens, greens are a combination of green and yellow. So negative in the A, positive in the B. The B value, the positive value, is going to be 1.5 to 2.5 times for green foliage of the A. So if I show an A of around -6, there's around there, I would anticipate that my B value will be between 9 and 15. If it's greater than that, it's probably a little bit too yellow for green foliage. If it's less than that, you probably don't have enough yellow in the greens. So they're ballpark art figures. It depends always on the photograph itself, but lab gives you, being able to read lab numbers gives you an indication whether or not your colors are going to be correct. So in this particular instance, I'm looking at the blue sky. I'm seeing -5, 6, so a little bit too much green for my liking. And so what I'll do is I'll come down to the HSL. I use basically basic tone curve and HSL in Lightroom. So I'll go to the hue, and I can adjust that.
I see you putting in your cursor in the sky and picking up these signs, but I don't see where the number values are showing.
Okay, look directly under the histogram.
Right?
Okay, do you see the numbers?
Yes, I see the numbers. They're real small on my screen, but I see the numbers.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's what I'm
Yeah.
looking at. The one
All
to
right.
the furthest left is the L channel, and that gives you what the luminance values are. The next one is the A channel, which is the green magenta axis, and the B channel, the last one on the right, the only one on the right, I guess, is the blue yellow axis. So in the green channel, I would probably, actually looking at it, it's fairly close to the parameters that I use, so I wouldn't change that. So I'll go into Photoshop. Hopefully, there we go. And so the first thing I do, as I mentioned before, is I run my denoise app. Denoise tends to be a little bit slow. Oops. My head gets in the way. There we go. I like denoise because it's very much automated. The auto setting usually takes care of 90% of the pictures, and it doesn't take that long. So the next thing I take a look at, as I mentioned before, is I want to go in and I want to make sure I don't have any dust bunnies or things sticking out where I don't want them to that I need to clone out. And for dust bunnies, I use an action. One of the panels that I purchased, it's an add-on, is TK for Tony Kuiper. And he has 4 panels that he sells. This one that's showing on the screen that I just pulled up is Rapid Mask, which gives you luminosity masks, among other things. And one of the actions he has is a dust and scratch. Okay. And I run that action. Let me show you how to make that. It's a real simple action if you want to make it yourself. So I'll add, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I'll add a transparency layer. On top of that, I will add a hue saturation adjustment layer and reduce saturation all the way to 0, making the pixel scale. And then I'll add levels adjustment layers, which I can adjust the sliders to give me the most contrast so I can see dust bunnies show up. And there are more than we saw when we first opened the picture, more that we can see. And then I'll use the, what's this called? Spot removal healing brush on our transparency layer. And then I can go through and remove all the dust bunnies about 10 times faster than you can do in Lightroom. Most of these dust bunnies would not show up in a print or in a digital photo because they're too light. But if you want to make sure everything is really clean in your skies, then you can use this method and clean up real quickly. All right, get rid of this one. And then the action closes the windows, and then I'll take that layer and I'll flatten everything out. So now I would take a look at color. And the first go around with color, I want to make sure that my color is going to be accurate. And as I mentioned before, we see things differently than the camera records information. And one of the phenomenon that we see, the difference how a camera would record, is called chromatic adaptation. And what chromatic adaptation is, I'll bring it up. File. Okay. Let's see if you can see this. So this is just out of Wikipedia, but it's the human visual system's ability to adjust to changes in illumination in order to preserve the appearance of object colors. Basically, when we look at a scene, we simultaneously and instantly neutralize color casts. As a for instance, as it applies to color correction, if we were in a forest, a rainforest, say up in the Hoh River or something in Washington, or over on the near Portland, Oregon, where Jonathan is tonight, if we're looking at the shadows, we would see green foliage. A camera would pick up cyan foliage. We would see a combination of green and yellow, even though it's in the shadows, because we automatically adapt to the illumination and eliminate color casts. So we're hardwired because of prior experience to see green foliage. The camera, on the other hand, picks up green and blue, which is cyan. And so that was something that I would take a look at and may have to color correct as I go through and make the corrections. Anyway, so that's this particular picture. I think we already color corrected when we were in Lightroom. If I had not color corrected it, what I would do is I would make some kind of adjustment, either a curves layer or a hue saturation layer, or sometimes selective color. And after I made my color correction, I would change the blending mode of the adjustment layer to color, because at this point I don't want to affect the luminosity of the picture. I just want to work on the color. In RGB, which yeah.
What mode were you in prior to just changing?
Normal.
Okay.
Normal mode.
All right.
Yeah. Where was it? Okay. RGB, each of the three channels, red, green, and blue, carries both luminance information and color information. So if you change the color, or if you change the luminance of a pixel, you'll change the opposite. You change color, you change luminance. You change the luminance, you change the color. It may not be a significant change, but it's a change nevertheless. And that's something I don't want to do. And that's why I separate color when I'm doing color correcting, separate color from luminosity. So let me get rid of these. So the next thing I do, as I mentioned before, is I'll go ahead and I'll make changes globally to contrast. And usually I'll do it on a pixel layer, and I'll name that CB. Name most of my layers. So I come back a year from now and I take a look at what I did. I understand what I did. And I take a look at most of the pictures. I'll take a look at the channel structure of the picture and see if there's any blend that I can do in the channels that would help bring out more contrast or even out contrast in the picture. So,
Jim?
Yeah.
Are you still in lab or RGB?
You know, when I open the picture, it opens in RGB. So I'm in RGB.
Okay.
Yeah.
When did you get out of lab?
I never left RGB.
Oh, I thought we were in lab for a while there.
No, never was in lab.
Okay.
What I do is use lab readouts for color correction, even though I'm RGB. If you look right here, my cursor is the info panel. On the left side it says RGB, and by default, then this will show the readouts of whatever color mode that you are in, every color space you're in. On the right side, I have LAB. By default, it's CMYK. I changed that to my default so I can read the lab numbers. If you push on the little, whatever that is, eyedropper, you can pick whatever color space or color model that you want to that's listed here. I can pick grayscale, and it'll give me grayscale readouts of, see it right there, it's a luminosity of 60% grayscale. And on the left side, it's giving me the RGB readouts. When I switch from or come out of Lightroom into Photoshop, I come out and into my normal working space, which is ProPhoto RGB at 360 ppi, 16-bit at the actual pixel resolution. And you can program Lightroom to output to Photoshop anything you want out of the preferences. So when it comes into Photoshop, I'm in RGB, and my normal working space is ProPhoto. So where was I? Back to the red, green, and blue channels. If you look at red, green, and blue, you see that they're different. The red channel tends to have the most contrast. The green channel has the most detail, and it's the flattest. It takes a curve better than either of the other two channels. And the blue channel is basically light and blue, and it's muddy and lacks a lot of detail in the greens and most of the reds. So when Photoshop puts together the color composite, the RGB layer, or excuse me, the RGB channel, it uses about 60% of the information from the green. It uses about 30% from the red and about 10% from the blue. And because this is real muddy, what I often do, like in a landscape, is I substitute the blue channel with the red channel. And to do that, I use one of the oldest commands in Photoshop, which is apply image. You go up to image, down to apply image, and the keyboard shortcut is Control M, and I'll do that instead. I think I will. I get the apply image command box. And it lets you pick a source, and it lets you pick what layer you want to put or exchange, and it lets you put in which channel you're going to exchange it to. And perhaps I can clear that up a little bit. Let me cancel that. My target channel is the blue. I'll bring up the apply image. I'm working from this layer, which is the merge layer. I'm working from only one document, which is the document I'm in, the file I'm in, and I'm going to switch the target image to the red channel and hit OK. Oh, what happened? That's not right. Let me try it again. Oh, no wonder it was in multiply. Okay. So now the red channel and the blue channel are the same, and the green channel is just like it was. And so because I only want to affect luminosity, I will change the blending mode to luminosity. And that's the picture I have now. And what's that done by putting the red into the blue is it's lightened up the greener a little bit, and it's darkened down, and it's balanced out the picture a little bit. I don't do it in every case. It's not needed in every case, but it's one of the uses of channel blending that I use on a regular basis. From here, what I would probably do is write a curve on the green channel. I look up at the histogram. I have a lot of room at the top. There's not a lot of information that's in the highlights. And so I want to boost that up. And I also want to make the shadows a little darker and give it a little bit more. There we go. So that was our beginning, and that's where we are now. Oops, what that do? There we go. So I've done once for color, I've done once for luminosity or contrast, and the second thing I look at is color again. Another interesting phenomenon of the human visual system that differs from what a camera records. Let me find it here. It's the rule of simultaneous contrast. And Michel Chevreul was a chemist in France in the 19th century, and he came up with this rule of simultaneous contrast, which basically states simultaneous contrast refers to the way in which two colors affect each other. The theory is that one color can change how we perceive the tone and hue of another when the two are placed side by side. The actual colors themselves don't change, but we see them as altered, where a camera does not. And let me close that. And there's a couple of rules of thumb that I copied. Okay, a dark color put next to a light one makes them both look brighter. A dark next to a bright makes the bright one look brighter. A dark next to a light makes the light seem lighter than the dark darker. Warm colors look warmer when placed next to cool ones. Cool colors look cooler when placed next to warm ones. A bright color next to a muted color makes the muted one look more dull. And if two colors are of similar brightness, the less bright they'll both look when placed next to each other. Basically, we saw more color variation in colors than a camera does. And so what I often do is to run an action, which does run in lab, which tends to separate the colors and add a little bit more saturation. Let me have a few examples of the law of simultaneous contrast. And here's one. Okay, two pairs. Looking at the two pairs, we have white stripes and black stripes all the way down. On the left, there's a pair with the black stripes on top, and on the right, the white stripes are on top. I have an echo in my earphones, so I'm going to turn that down. Okay, if I look at it, it looks like the pair on the left is darker than the pair on the right. Our visual system, because of the juxtaposition of the black stripes on the left and the white stripes on the right, make the pair look darker on the left and the pair on the right look lighter. If I go over to my info palette and bring up lab numbers again, if I hover over the pair on the left, it has a value, a luminance value of 89. The one on the right has a luminance value of 89. They both have exactly the same luminance value. The color of the pair on the left is exactly the same as the color on the right. So we see the pair on the left as being darker, whereas the camera and our machine see the pair, or both of the pairs, as being the same, exactly the same. So that's one of the reasons I do the color variation. I have another example, and you've probably seen these before, but I always found them interesting. Here's another example of the rule of simultaneous contrast. In this particular picture, we have a checkerboard with gray. So light gray and dark gray checkerboard with, I don't know, a dowel, green dowel, light coming in from the right, and we have the two spots on the checkerboard. In looking at it, I see the one in the middle being lighter than the one at the top. Photoshop, if I hover over what looks brighter to me, I see a luminance value of 68. If I hover over the one at the top, which looks darker, I have a luminance value of 68. And the color, 45 and 75, and the bottom is 45, 75. They're both have the same luminance value, and they're both the same color. So it's an optical illusion to us that the camera is not going to pick up. So when color correcting, I keep this in mind. A couple of ways that I go about separating the colors, making the picture look more like what I would have seen at the scene than what was recorded by the camera. The easiest way, I think, is just to add an adjustment layer, which is the vibrance, and add a little vibrance in there. And a little saturation. So that's one way. What I use is a rather long action from an add-on that I have. This is a free add-on. It's called a Picture Postcard Workflow. It's by Dan Margulis, who's one of the gurus in color correction in the system. And this panel is free. And if anybody's interested in obtaining it, then I have the email address where you can get it. And not only does it have the panel, but it goes into quite a lot of detail with regard to color theory and how to use the panel. So I'll run my action. I tend to be very automated. If I can automate it, I do. It saves a lot of time. There we go. I'm not going to go into the details of the action. So this action works in lab. It converts the RGB image into lab and then runs lab curves, among other things. And then I've added to the action so that the picture comes back in as a group with a color layer set to color and a luminosity layer set to luminosity. So I'll take a look at the color layer and adjust it, and take a look at the luminosity layer. And I'll leave it there. So once for color, once for luminosity or contrast, and another one for color. Oftentimes the blue skies will shift to the green when it comes out of lab. And what I do in that instance is I'll make a mask and mask out the sky. So there's a lot of ways to do masking. I use a channel mask most often in this instance. And to make a channel mask, I'll just duplicate a channel, the blue channel, since the sky's blue, run a levels adjustment, get rid of any of the light colors on the bottom. And where's my... Do the same for the top. And add a mask on the color layer. The way I add the mask or put something in the mask is, again, I use the apply image command. And the reason for doing that is that you can load a mask with a selection. But when you do that, Photoshop goes from, I use 16-bit. I'm always in 16-bit. When you use the selection to make a mask, Photoshop under the hood switches to 8-bit to load the mask and then switches back to 16-bit, which I don't like to do. And we'll go back one. Okay. If you use apply image, everything stays in 16-bit. And so I'll just apply the blue copy channel to my mask. And oops, I'll invert it. So no, I didn't change the color of the blue sky at all. So as far as which one is better, I usually prefer the lab action. I'm gonna get rid of this. So that's basically what I do in every case. Now I go into more specific types of techniques depending on what the photograph is about. In this particular one, I would probably change out the sky. And also, this is a good example of where you can use a perspective adjustment. So, perspective adjustment technique, I'll add a stamp layer on top and name it perspective. Make it a smart object. And then go to Edit, Transform, and Warp. So the Warp tool in the latest renditions of Photoshop is greatly improved over what was in Photoshop prior to that. Before the latest rendition, when you warped the whole picture. Now you can isolate certain areas of the photograph and just warp that section. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to raise the top of this mountain, and just for the purpose of demonstration, and also it kind of makes the photograph maybe a little bit more dynamic. So and I'll just lift the top of the mountain up. There's a lot of different ways of doing this. You can use puppet warp. You can use perspective warp to some degree, but the new warp tool in the latest rendition of Transform works really well. The thing you want to be careful with is take a close look, and that's why I make it a smart object in case I make a mistake. But if you go to 100%, if you go too far, you'll start seeing stretching, and it won't look right. And here, I think I'm fine. Okay.
So Jim, you're saying you're making mountains out of molehills.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so before and after. So that's perspective warp. Or excuse me, that's the warp tool. Next, I want to replace the sky, and again, the latest renditions of Photoshop have the sky replacement tool. There's other sky replacement tools on the market. Luminar AI is out. They came out first with sky replacement. The problem with them, I think, is that you can only use JPEGs, whereas in Photoshop, their sky replacement, you can download your own high-resolution TIFF images. So you can keep your image at 16-bit rather than dropping in an 8-bit JPEG. So I'll go to Edit and Sky Replacement, brings up the bounding box, and whatever's in the box up here, you have to wait until it loads. And then you can choose whatever sky you want. And I've loaded up a bunch of them. I have my own file. You can make your own file and load up the pictures that you've taken. And that's what I've done here. So I'll just pick one. The plus button down here, what you can do is press that, and then you can go to any file on your computer and upload or put into the Photoshop's directory for sky replacement pictures of your choice. And on my desktop, I keep a cloud file, and it has a lot of different types of cloud pictures. And I just go to one and, you know, let's pick this one here. And it'll upload it, and then I can use it. I like the first one better anyway. And then you can do a number of things. I would tend to brighten this up a little bit. Try to get it to match, hit OK. And then you can adjust, you can transform the clouds any way you want. Once you get back into Photoshop, you can brighten it. It comes loaded with a brightness contrast adjustment layer they can use to adjust the picture to the background. So I went from the beginning. We didn't make any color corrections, but we did make a little contrast adjustments, and then we added the action that add a little variation, more variation in color and a little bit more saturation. Then I made a perspective adjustment and then did a composite with the sky. At this point, I'm about ready to finish with the photograph, and I mentioned before that usually I apply a blur, and I have a lot of blur filters that I use, Orton's. So I have my own set of Ortons. Mark Adamus has a number of Ortons that I've gotten from him. And I can't remember where I got these from, but they're very useful. So I'll use a heavy blur. And what the Orton does, it adds an overlay, and it tends to brighten slightly the brightest and darken slightly the darkest, and it saturates colors. And it opens with an opacity of 30%, which you can adjust down to nothing, or it just gives it a little bit of a boost. And then I apply my sharpening function. And this particular sharpening function is a long one, and it takes a little while. It's about 175 steps. Basically, again, it goes into lab and makes unsharp mask changes in lab. And the reason it does that is because going into lab, in lab, it does not cause a color shift in the halos that you would get with staying in RGB. It uses regular unsharp mask, and it uses also a higher lume unsharp mask. So it differentiates between the high frequency areas where there's a lot of detail and the low frequency areas where there's not much detail, and applies a different type of sharpening to those areas. And I'll rasterize that layer. And you can see that it not only is it sharpened, but it affects luminosity of the Orton layer. And what I often do is I will adjust the Orton layer and the sharpening layer to try to get the best blend between the two. And then last but not least, what I mentioned, I add a final tone layer. And this is just to check how much of the dynamic range I've used. And so I'll go up to image and hit auto tone, which has been around forever. And it makes the darks a little darker and the whites a little whiter. And what it's done is it's plugged up the shadows, it's blocked the shadows, and it's blown out the lightest highlights, which I'm not real fond of. But it did a nice job in the midtones, which I kind of like. So what I would do probably is bring up blend diff sliders and take down the height and luminosity of the highlights and unplug the shadows while leaving the midtones where they are. So now I have a full range of dynamic range. I've used everything up, and I have good contrast. Not a lot of difference, but a little bit, and I'd be ready to close. So that is my basic workflow with a couple of specialized techniques. So, any questions so far? I have some demonstrations where some specific techniques that I use that I want to go into.
Jim?
Yeah.
You talk about blur filter?
Yeah.
And then you sharpen after that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Can you go in a little more detail about that?
Yeah, I can. I'll show you with the next photograph. I have one for John, and it's this one. I think it was John. Correct me if I'm wrong, John. A couple of months ago, somebody had a picture at one of the competitions, and it had red flowers in it. And the red flowers, the reds were kind of like they are here, not as bad as this at all. Looking at the flowers, the red channel that has the red color is blown out. And so there's no detail in the red flowers in here. If I take a look at an expanded view of the histogram, the green channel's fine. It's not blown out. And the blue channel's fine. It's not blown out. But the red channel, where the red flowers live, is blown out. And so we've lost a lot of detail in the flowers. So this is a quick fix in situations like this. And it's another example how you can use channel blending to save a picture. So what I'm going to do, take a look at here's the red channel. There's no detail whatsoever in here. It has detail in this area, and there's obviously a lot of contrast, but there's no detail in the flowers. The green channel is the flattest, but you could curve this quite a bit. And then the blue channel, it's almost black in the red. So again, I'm going to make a mask, and this time I'm going to use Tony Kuiper's rapid mask, and I'm going to use color, and I'm going to use red, and see what comes up, and then adjust that with a levels adjustment. There we go. Bring this down. Then use a brush to clean this up. So, oops, wrong way. I would spend a lot more time with this if I were going to do something with this picture, but for demonstrational purposes, I'm moving pretty quick.
Which tool are you using to spot this? Are
Pardon
you
me?
using the healing brush or the healing tool?
Right now, I'm using
Yeah.
a regular brush, John, and I'm using white on white, and then where I want it black, then I'll use a black brush.
Okay.
Okay, so that's my mask as it is. Okay, so what I want to do is I'll make another layer. And I've looked at my channels, and I see that the green channel has a great deal of information in it, which I could use to put detail into the red channel. So I will bring up apply image. Oops, I didn't pick my target, so my target's red. Bring up my apply image, and I'm going to put in the RGB, which is the composite, in normal mode. And that added a lot of detail from the green channel back into the red. And then I'm going to write curves on the green channel to lighten it up. I don't want to affect the other elements of the picture. I just want to affect the flowers. So I'm going to add a mask, and I prepared that down below. And again, because I don't want to switch to 8-bit, I want to keep in 16-bit. I'm going to use apply image, and I'll apply the rapid mask to the mask up here. And then because I'm just dealing with luminosity, with detail rather than color, I'll change the layer mode to luminosity. And the difference is that. And you can do that as many times as you want. You can do it over and over and add more and more detail back into the flowers. And I suppose you could also, let me go back here, compact view, add a selective color adjustment layer in the reds and lighten or darken those reds. So that is a quick fix for colors that are blown out by the camera.
Amazing.
Okay, let me go back to.
Now, these are Photoshop tools you're using.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
You talk about lab, it means the Photoshop lab.
Well,
it's not a
no.
different program.
No, no. Photoshop lets you use different color models. Lab is a color model. RGB is a color model. CMYK is a color model. And you can also work in grayscale, which they consider a color model. And
So
Adobe.
Where do you acquire the RGB in the scheme of things here? Where do you turn on the RGB?
How do you turn it on?
Where is it?
You don't really turn it on. When you come into Photoshop, your working space, your picture when it comes in is already in RGB, unless you tell whatever program that you are using to come in under a different color model. But the default color model for Photoshop is RGB. Is RGB.
Because I have not personally
Pardon me?
found that separation of the three colors tool yet, so that's something new to me.
Yeah, RGB. Your camera, most cameras, digital cameras, have a Bayer array, and the Bayer array basically is a system of squares, and in the square are two green receptors which only accept wavelengths that we would consider green. There's one red in that square, and then there's one blue. And so that information, when it's stored in the camera, the information from the receptors that only accept what we consider to be green light go into kind of a file, a channel. And the one that's red, the information that comes into the photons that come in a wavelength that we would consider red goes into a different channel, and the blue a different channel. And then when they're combined to make a color composite, then
I understand the concept.
Okay.
The point I'm trying to find is on the screen. How do I get the three channels that I can manipulate them?
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me, I'll bring up another one. So let's bring up, I'll show you that in a minute, okay?
Okay.
So here's another photograph, and we go to the basic. This already is a fair balance as far as exposure is concerned. I might take my white balance tool and hit it on the snow so that it's white. I also might add some saturation and some vibrance because I can make this a black and white. And then I'll go ahead and move it into Photoshop.
Now that's from Lightroom.
That's from Lightroom.
Yeah, right.
So now I'm in Photoshop. Now, you have the layers panel, or you have your various layers in it, and you have your channels panel. And the primary channels are the red, the green, and the blue. So that's where your channels are. Does that answer your question?
Now, where did you get this middle screen here between the picture and the basic screen? Where did you get that from?
What little screen?
The middle screen.
Okay, am I hovering over it?
No, over here. To the right, to the right, to the right.
Here?
To the right. There. That
this
screen.
Oh, that's info palette.
Info palette. Okay.
If you come up to the command bar and you go to Windows, it has all the palettes listed.
Okay, so that's
and the info palette. When you touch on that, it'll bring it up.
I'm boring the other guys because this is old stuff to them, but for me, it's unfamiliar territory. I'm still learning the program.
Oh yeah, well, no problem. It took me years to do it, and I still don't know it all that well. I would not consider myself to be an expert by any means.
Well, you're far beyond what I am. Most of you are, but I get asked these questions by some of the newbies. You know, how you do this, how you do that.
No, ask as many questions as you want. If I know the answer, I'll try to answer it. If I don't know it, then I'll let you know.
Right.
Yeah, Jonathan?
That's good. But I appreciate what you're doing. You're doing a great job.
Jonathan, did you have a question?
No, I think you're doing a great job. It might be a little bit complicated for some of us, but that's a motivation to learn.
That's right.
Well, hopefully I'm not, it's not too complicated.
Well, one
I
of the
know
good
there's
things,
a lot of information that I've imparted.
this is being recorded, and you can later on you can go back, you can stop, you can back up, you can look at it, and hopefully that will help clarify a few things.
It'll help clarify a lot of things because then you can stop and find the cursor where it's clicking, things like that. That's what I have found with most of these informational meetings is that it goes, because it's new to you, you don't have time to absorb it. And going back and looking at the other ones, you can begin to adjust to it and figure out how it works.
All right, I'm going to move on.
Yeah, move on. Don't hold up for me.
Okay, so in this, again, I'm back in Photoshop. I've opened the picture in Photoshop. What I would do was I'd run a noise, my noise program. I'm not going to do it because I've already shown that. And then I would check for dust bunnies and anything that needs to be cloned out that's obvious, which I'm not going to do. And I'm not going to check for color because I'm going to make it a black and white, and I'll do that now. One thing I do with, there we go. One thing I do before I go into a black and white conversion oftentimes is I will accentuate the colors so that I get more contrast. The brighter the colors are, the more lighter or darker the conversion is going to be. So by amping up the saturation a little bit, you tend to get a better black and white. So I ramped up the colors in Lightroom already. So my go-to program for conversion is Nik software. And recently I bought the pay version. There's still a free version out there that you can use in the latest edition of Photoshop. It works fine. But the pay version has updated their UIs, which makes it much more usable, especially on a 4K or a 6K monitor. So it makes a big difference, and I like it. And I don't go into a lot of detail when I use Nik. I just find one that I kind of like, and I've used this one before, and I'm going to use it again. I just want to make sure that I protect my highlights and my shadows, because in this particular picture, I want to show you my my go-to dodge and burn technique. Okay, so now we've converted to black and white, or monochrome. And if you look at the histogram, I have room at the top. That means my highlights are not blown out, and I have room to lighten them up a little bit. And my shadows aren't blown out or plugged up either. So looking at my highlights, I have an 87 in lab. In lab terms, you retain detail up to about 96 or 97. Anything over that, you lose your detail and you're just white. So I have plenty of room. I'm at 90 here. I'm at 87 there. 82 down here. My clouds are low 90s. So I have plenty of room where I can use dodging and burning techniques to add contrast to the photograph. And so I use a technique that I learned maybe about a year ago by a guy named Alistair Bean, and he's a Scottish photographer, and he's been using this system for a couple of years. And basically, you're using the history brush in either multiply or screen mode through a luminosity mask to lighten or darken specific areas of the photograph. And with the method, you can be very specific about which areas that you want to affect and lighten and darken. So here goes. This uses the rapid mask, Tony Kuiper's rapid mask, which I mentioned before, and his palettes, which work well with Photoshop and always have, cost $29. There are free versions out there that would probably work just as well. There's other pay versions. Jimmy McIntyre has one. Retouching Toolkit has one that work pretty well. But for this particular technique, I use Tony Kuiper's. So this is my action, and if you want it, I can send it to you. So it tells me to open Tony Kuiper and hit the composite button, and by doing so, it loads the highlights. So it will select pixels that have a luminosity value of 128 or above. So those are the lights. And it will not select those below that. And once I do that, you see a range of numbers here, and those are luminosity selections. So that's the base. That's 50% of the base. That's 50% of the one before it, etc. And by going further and further, you isolate the highlights more and more. And so you can get very specific. I mean, there's hardly anything here, but you can just adjust that little area there by using the method. And there's other methods of doing this, but I prefer this. So what I would like to do is lighten the snow up here. And so let's try 4 looks good. And now the selection is loaded, and I can use my history brush, and I will set the mode to screen, and I'll use a real low flow. I'll use about 10%. And then paint over the areas fairly liberally. And I only affect those areas which I selected through the luminosity mask. I'm not sure if you can see that difference. It's very subtle. And that's what's nice about this technique, is they can be very subtle and be very exact, not only to where you're applying lightening or darkening, but also the degree to which you're lightening and darkening. So now I'll come in, I'll go back to my luminosity mask, and I'll go to darks. And so now the light areas are the dark areas, and the dark areas are what's really bright. And so I'll accept that, and still using my history brush, I'll go to multiply, and I'll darken the darker areas a little bit. And then also I would probably want to lighten up the waterfall here. That's Bridal Veil. So I go back to my luminosity mask and see where that waterfall lies. As far as luminosity, there it's barely visible, so I'd go to 1. Go back to my screen mode, probably jump the flow up. I'll go to 30%. And now I can lighten up the waterfall without touching the surrounding rocks.
Now, I noticed you didn't challenge the very bottom of the fall where it's misty.
No, I could without problem. I just want to do this for demonstration to show you the
Okay.
versatility that this particular technique brings. So that's before, and that's after. So I've lightened the lights, darkened the darks, and brought through contrast, build up contrast, and your attention is drawn more to this area than here, where it was a bit flatter. And then when leaving, and you're done, then you have to deselect. So I hit Control D, Command D on the Mac, and I'm done. So that's dodging and burning technique. Again, I do have an action which works very well. This incorporated that technique, and if anybody wants to have it, then I can send it to you in email.
Would
The
you
next
do that,
thing I want to,
please?
pardon me?
Would you do that, please?
Yeah, sure.
And the where to get this program?
The Tony Kuiper?
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, I'll do that. In fact, what I'll do at the end of this recording, whatever you call it, I have the email address for Tony Kuiper on the internet, and also for that picture postcard workflow panel.
Good.
One other thing. So,
By the way, we call this a presentation, and you're doing a great job.
well, thanks, John. I appreciate it. One thing that bothers me about this particular photograph is the sky. And so I want to fix the sky. And you can do this in color photographs or in black and whites. So I'm going to call this raw. And it's the camera raw filter. So I'll come to filters, the camera raw filter. Hopefully, there it is. And I've got to move myself out of the picture. Okay. So it's the camera raw filter. It's basically the same commands that you have in Lightroom. But this is the camera raw filter in Photoshop. And so I'll go down here to the dehaze slider and
Oh, wow, that does bring the clouds out.
yep, I add a lot of dehaze. You can add a lot of clarity. And I might add some texture to the clouds. No, I don't think I will. I think I'll leave it a little bit fuzzy.
Darkened the rocks.
Mm-hmm.
The clouds came out beautiful, but before, now it looks okay, but before the rocks began to get real dark and contrasty.
And they're still dark and contrasty. So what I want to do is add a mask. And then I'm going to use my apply image, and I'm going to apply the background, not the merged image. I'm going to apply the background, and I'm going to put in, let's see which one I want. Blue, green, red, or just the RGB. I think I'll just use the RGB. And that takes some of the darkness out of the shadows. And whenever you do something like that, you want to blur your mask. I'm going to blur it at about 24. And the difference it makes is that it makes it much sharper when you blur the mask. Okay, so
just the opposite of what you would think. Blur would be blurred, not sharp.
Exactly. It's the opposite of what you would think. So here's the before camera raw filter, and here's the after, and then I can adjust the opacity a little bit. And I'll leave it at that. You could do a lot more corrections to get it exactly the way you want to, but I'm just showing the technique. And then I would finish off again by adding a Orton blur. And using my sharpen action.
So we have about 5 or 10 more minutes, Jim.
Okay, I'm gonna stop here then and take any questions. I have another couple of demonstrations, but they'll take too long.
Have you tried the Visa's control point to specifically lighten or darken an area in your photograph?
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with the Visa. It's just not quite as accurate as using luminosity masks. You can be more exact.
Okay.
It's not a difficult technique at all. Once you learn how to do it, it's really quite easy.
Any more questions?
Let's let this finish. This action is, like I said, is very long, and I'm using, there we go, finally.
Well, you said you had more to present, Jonathan. He could possibly do another presentation down the road.
Yeah, this is part A. Maybe do a part B.
Okay, that's fine with me. So I'm done with this. Let me put up, let's see, go to E, program night. Okay, here is Tony Kuiper Photography. It's https / at goodlight.us. So that's the one that I'm currently using. So that'll be on the presentation recording.
Great.
And then the PPW download is at https / www.ladette.com / margulis / ppw. So anybody wanting to at least take a look at that one, there is a great deal of information about color theory that comes with the download and on the site itself.
Great.
Okay, I don't have anything else then. Are there any other questions?
Good job.
On behalf of the club, I want to tell you, Jim, you did a fantastic job again. Even outdid your frog, and well done.
Okay.
Now that might be something you might want to show down the road, is how you put the frog in there. But that's just a little humor.
I'm not sure the frog would agree though.
Well, the frog might be free that night. You just have to figure out what night he's available.
I have to check the Frog Union.
Yeah, check the frog union. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate your presence.
Good job, Jim. Good job.
Okay.
Thank you,
Talk to
Jim.
you guys later.
All right.